The only living vertebrates today are the jawed vertebrates, including chondrichthyans or sharks and rays, actinopterygians, the ravenfish, and sarcopterygians, including tetrapods, birds, mammals, and ultimately ourselves. And the only other group of living vertebrates are the jawless vertebrates known as cyclostomes, or hagfish and lamprey. And these have a poor fossil record and don't have a mineralised component of their skeleton, so don't really give us much information about how the vertebrate skeleton evolved. Lucky for us, we have the fossil record, and positioned between these two groups are a paraphyletic group of extinct jawless vertebrates known as the ostracoderms. These include the heterostracans, which I work on, phelodonts, anaspids, galeaspids, which are endemic to China, and the osteostracans, which are the sister group to jawed vertebrates. And seen within this group is the first appearance of many vertebrate novelties that lead to the vertebrate skeleton as we know today. So the ostracoderms first appear in the fossil record during the Ordovician period. This is mainly in the form of micromerit remains, of fragments, with a handful of articulated specimens. And it's not until the Wenlock during the Silurian period that many of these groups appear fully formed with high levels of diversity. They dominate vertebrate assemblages up into the lower Devonian, where they begin to decline and all groups go extinct at the end of Devonian mass extinction. There are some phylogenies in place for a majority of the groups of the jawless vertebrates, but there's not one yet in place for the heterostracans. So they are taxonomically the largest group, with over 130 genera and 300 species. A synapomorphy of the group is having a single pair of branchial openings, which is sometimes, not always, covered by a plate. And instead of having an internal skeleton like we did, they have a dermoskeleton. This is a bony carapace that enclosed their head shields. And this was made of aspidin, which is a type of acellular bone. There are 5 main groups recognised in the heterostracans, and today I'm going to talk to you about the pterospidiforms and the somostids. And as I said, the evolution relationships of the group are largely not well known. This hinders our interpretation of the sequence and timing of vertebrate novelties, and also looking at things like dispersal and biogeography. So pterospidiforms are the largest group within heterostracans, with 47 genera. They first appear in the fossil record during the Predolli of the Canadian Arctic, and the last member is in the Juvetian, also in Canada. And they're characterised by having these separate plates. So they have the big dorsal plate, ventral, rostral, pineal, paired orbital, branchial, and sometimes corneal plates, and these are all separate plates. And these are 2 nice examples. They're articulated, which most of my material isn't. And you can see in the bottom one, Doriaspis, there's actually a tail preserved, which that's quite unusual. And there has been some debate whether the somostids should be included in the pterospidiforms. The somostids, like the pterospidiforms, have these separated plates, and they also have these platelets or fields of tesserae surrounding these plates, which has led some to believe they are closely related. But other workers, due to their tessellated plates, believe they more akin to some tessellated, more primitive forms, so it's not really known their position as it stands. These are some previous classifications. As you can see, the somostids have been placed as a sister group to pterospidiforms, derived and in a primitive position within pterospidiforms. So there's been a bit of debate. And also F is the most recent phylogeny for the pterospidiforms, and you can see there's under 20 taxa, which is genera, so it's well under half their diversity. So the aim of my study was to create a phylogeny for all taxonomically described pterospidiforms, also to see whether the somostids fall within them, and explore different coding methods using continuous characters, which I'll go on to explain a bit later. So I had 51 taxa, so that includes 47 in-group, 2 out-group, which are the aspids, and 2 representative somostids. I used parsimony analysis, and I had 3 main different coding methods. The first was to use discrete-only characters, which is quite traditional in phylogenetic analysis. The second is to use discrete and continuous characters, and the third is to use a gap coding method. So I'm sure most of you know a discrete character for an example of this would be, does the fish have a separate dorsal spine? And if it does, you'd code present 1, and if it doesn't, absent. 0, sorry. So I also decided to use continuous characters. So in a lot of taxonomic descriptions and previous phylogenetic analysis, things are often described as long or short, wide or narrow, and it's not really clear how that can be translated into phylogenetic analysis. So I decided to include this within my study. And one such example would be the posterior part of the orbital plate, which is often described as short or long. And this is just some ordered data. I'll use ratio data to standardise for size. And this is just some ordered data that I've collected. So it's the front part of the orbital plate to the orbital plate length. And you can see here it's quite continuously variable. And when the continuous data is used in a phylogenetic analysis, it's quite arbitrary to the different states they use. One such example is the dorsal plate, which is often described as wide or narrow, and with 0.7 as the boundary between what is considered wide or narrow. And you can see here it's kind of quite arbitrary where they placed it. So one way to incorporate continuous characters is to use a gap coding method. This was done by Rob Sansom when he's working on osteostracans, and you can see here he has ordered data and he's identified a gap and then used this to assign different character states. I wanted to be a bit more objective about this, so I tried, because it wasn't really clear what was a gap. As you can see here, this is the dorsal plate width to length, and there wasn't really clear gaps that I'd be that confident in assigning myself by eye. So I decided to look at the difference between each data point. So the first data point there is the difference between the first ordered data point and the second and third. I then identified which data points were over 2 standard deviations of the whole data and used this to infer where the gaps are in my data, and then assign different character states to the data then. So I also included continuous characters, as I said, but because I used some of the measurements as a reference point, so I often use the dorsal plate length as a reference point, I was concerned that some of the characters might be correlated. And as you can see here, these are all the significantly correlated characters I had. I then decided, when I did a Pearson's correlation, I then decided to remove the characters starting with the most highly correlated character. As you can see here, 59 is correlated 12 times, so I identified that, removed it, and reordered the data. I removed it one by one until there's no correlated characters. And this, unfortunately, took my continuous character list down from 22 characters to 8. Just moving on to the results. So the first result is from the discrete-only analysis. And you can see here, the first result is an equally weighted analysis, and there's quite good resolution in the base of the tree, but moving away from the root, it seems to be quite a large polytomy. So I decided to use implied weighting, which re-weights characters based on their homoplasia index. And you can see I have quite better resolution in my tree. I'm just going to highlight a couple of clades that seem to be consistent throughout my analysis. So the semosteids in both of these do seem to fall within the pterosphidiforms, and they seem to come out quite often in the clade in this position, often with Xylaspis, Doriaspis and Woodfordaspis. Another consistency are taxa towards the base of the tree. This clade here with Erevaspis and Rhinopteraspis, and then some wide-shielded forms seem to be in a quite derived position within the tree. Moving on to my discrete and continuous. The equally weighted did leave me with one most parsimony tree, but that was only once I kind of did quite a more rigorous search in tree space. Only a slightly longer tree seemed to be highlighted in bold, the only relationships were covered in a slightly longer tree. So I decided to use implied weighting again, and it seems to be a lot more resolved and quite well comparable to the discrete-only analysis. Again, I'm just going to highlight consistent clades, the semosteids fall within them, in this same clade here. The basal taxa seem to be consistent along with this clade, and the wild shielded forms. Next, moving on to the discrete and discretized, or the gap-coded data. In the equally weighted analysis here, it seems to be really poorly resolved, again, with the majority taxa in a large polytomy. So I again applied implied weighting, but it does seem to be quite a different topology, especially for the majority of the tree. Most of the taxa seem to be split into 2 clades, which is different from what I had in the previous analysis. So it just seems to give me quite varied results. Again, just going to highlight the taxa that seem to be kind of in the same places or the same relationships. So I wanted to kind of test to see whether my phylogeny made sense, and it wasn't really clear which one of the phylogenies was best, but the one with the discrete and continuous characters seemed to make more sense when looked at their stratigraphical occurrence. So it does seem to make sense, as some of the most primitive taxa seem to have the first stratigraphic occurrence, mainly from the Canadian Arctic, whereas some of the more derived taxa in my tree seem to have some of the latest occurrence. So from the Western United States, these are wild shielded forms. And there are some inconsistencies in there, but it does seem to make sense. And I'm aware that I'm just kind of giving you a list of names, so I'm just quickly give you some reconstructions that other authors have done. So these are kind of the smaller, kind of blunt-nosed forms that seem to be the base of the tree. Moving on, this is the Spitzbergen Doriaspis with a long pseudorostrum and the semosteid at the top there. These these taxa are Rhinopterospis and Eravaspis, and these seem to have more blade-like rostrum and reduced corneal plates. And then taxa from Podolia seem to have larger corneal plates and not so sharp rostrum, and then again the wild shielded forms. So it does seem to be picking up some morphological variation. So to conclude, this is the first phylogenetic analysis to include all taxonomically described genera. The Smocids do seem to fall well within the Pterospida often with Xylaspis, Doriaspis and Woodfordaspis, which agrees with the hypothesis of some previous authors. Implied weighting seems to include the resolution in all my analysis, which indicates there's quite a lot of homoplasia within my data set. This is probably mainly because the Pterospida like I said, most of their taxonomy seems to be on the proportions or variations of the plates. So it's not really easy to transfer this into phylogenetic characters. The discrete and discrete with continuous characters seem to recover similar signals, with the raw continuous given the greater stratigraphical congruence. And the gap coding gives, although it does give quite a well-resolved tree, it seems to be quite different from the other results. And this, I think, mainly is because the gap coding is highly sensitive to missing data. So it's not really clear whether I just have missing data or whether a gap is like a new evolutionary event, so a change in morphology. So moving forward, I want to expand the data set to include all heterostracans, and I'm currently working on a phylogeny to incorporate the Southspididae, which is another major group in the Pterospidiforms. And lastly, I'd like to thank the University of Manchester, NERC, and everyone who let me have access to specimens, and thank you for listening.